Thank you, everyone. This is Christina Anderson, Wisconsin Land+Water. We are here today to talk with Rod Webb about the communicating conservation and the culture of agriculture. And this is a part of our sitcom Basics in Agriculture for Conservationists series that we'll be running. We have 4 webinars and 2 in-person trainings, 1 a classroom session on June 2nd in Columbia County and 1 a field day on June 7th at the Arlington Research Center. If you're interested, I can send out a link. I'll put the link on this recorded webinar at the end of the presentation so you can make your way for registration. But thank you, Rod, very much for agreeing to teach us a little bit about what has helped Pierce County get going. So why don't you go right ahead? Thanks.
Thank you, Christina. We'll get started on this very interesting topic this morning. I appreciate everyone taking the time to listen in, and I hope what I have to share can help you out in the future. I've been at this for quite a few years now, and when Christina asked me if I would do this, I thought, this should be fairly straightforward. I've been doing it a long time. Then when I sit down and start thinking about, well, how do we actually talk to farmers and how do we work with agriculture in general, it's a little more complex than I thought, but we'll give this a shot. We start out with our beginning slide here. I found this picture when I was going through old files, and I thought it said a lot about what people that live on farms, that make their living off farms, really think about, and how much they appreciate where they live and what they get to do for a livelihood. So, and now my screen is not working. This is
It's just not advancing?
Exactly. Let me try a couple. Okay. Sorry about that. A little panic set in right away. Understanding agriculture. I guess to really start to understand agriculture, you got to understand the diversity that is out there on farms. In Pierce County and throughout Wisconsin, we got so many different types of farms. We have our modern CAFOs, our large livestock facilities that get a lot of attention nowadays. But a lot of our customers are still smaller beef operations, cash crop farming, grazing, vegetable farming. We have organic and I guess non-organic farming, so there's always a lot of different farms, different setups out there, and that's what makes it challenging and very interesting. We've got to keep in mind the heritage that is out there when you're approaching farmers and going out on maybe the initial visits. There's sometimes been generations and generations of the same family on this farm, so there's a lot of things that are ingrained in what happens on day-to-day, month-to-month activities out there. Landowners are generally very proud of what they have out there. They've worked hard. They've potentially grown up working with their parents or grandparents on the farm, and it shows up in the decisions they make quite often. It's always quite entertaining when you're out, walking and talking and the guy that owns the farm, they don't necessarily refer to it as their farm, especially if they have more than one tract of land or something. It may be the Bauer farm or the Olson farm, and you have to start asking questions to figure out, where that naming come from, and it's usually because of the heritage of the farm. And it also can come into play on how decisions are made. I remember several years ago I worked with a landowner on a couple of different projects. We would, it was a long drawn out process, and we'd get just about ready to start the project and he would cancel out. This happened a couple of times over a 6 or 7 year period, and come to find out that even though he was on the farm, I always thought he owned the farm. There was some other family members in play, that the parents had a land contract on the farm, and that they were dead set against him making any changes to how the farm looked in the past. So you never know how heritage and former generations can affect what's being, the decisions that are being made on the farm. Farmers in general are extremely dedicated to their work. They love what they do. They're self-employed. They get to make the decisions on a daily basis on their own or with other family members or other partners, but it's generally not anyone telling them what they have to do. So we got to keep that in mind when we go out to work with them on their farm, that we got to make sure they're part of the decision-making process, so we're not just telling them what we'd like to have done. Farmers work long hours. Like I said, they're extremely dedicated to their work, love what they do, and that shows up when you get to know these guys and start talking with them on their day-to-day activities. They're also extremely competitive. I've noticed over the years, if you can start working in an area and you find a farm, say in a sub-watershed project, and you want to get on other farms out there, if you can get that first one going, the neighbors see that happening. They like the way it looks. They want to make sure that they get involved. So competition can play into how fast a project moves, or when you can be making advances in your goals. People in agriculture have had to be problem solvers. They're always given different issues, different challenges. So when we're talking conservation, that's why we want to always make sure that we're listening as much as we are talking. We're discussing it. A lot of times landowners can come up with some great ideas, and then the conservation staff can kind of help mold their ideas and come up with a good project or a good solution. So they're extremely good problem solvers, and we can learn a lot from getting to know how they address and attack problems. They're also businessmen. This is their livelihood, and we have to keep that in mind when we're suggesting changes, when we're asking them to do different things. This is their livelihood, and at times it can be scary. They're comfortable with what they've been doing in the past. If we're asking them to change their tillage practices or something like that, and they're hesitant, we got to understand that it's because they have been making a living the way they've been doing it, and they may be resistant to change. it's a real big point here in my mind is people involved in agriculture are definitely stewards. They take care of the land. That's, there's varying degrees of that, obviously, but when it comes right down to it, most of them are proud of what they have, and they want to take care of it. They take care of the soil, the trees on their farm. They take care of the wildlife. It's amazing the number of farms that you go out on nowadays and maybe be there in late fall and all the harvesting is done and you'll see some crops still off in a corner of the field or something next to the woods, and the farmer will say, well, yeah, I always leave a couple acres for the deer or the turkeys or something. They may complain about them early in the growing season when you're talking with them, but when it comes down to it, they're worried about taking care of the wildlife and everything that is part of their farm. So they're definitely stewards of the land. Preparation is, really key in just about any occupation, but I feel it's really important when we're working with agriculture. As the little clip art shows here, if any of you were followers of Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner in your earlier days, Wile E. always had a plan and was going to catch the Roadrunner, and this time he had some special shoes he was going to use, so he did his prep, and well, it didn't always pay off, but we hope that our prep does. So do your homework on the farm. Know the farm history. If you have conservation plans that have 6 notes in them, if you haven't been out on the farm yet, sit down and read through those, learn a little bit of history there. If you have other staff members that have been around in the office a long time, they may have a little history they can share with you. Your NRCS staff or FSA staff may be able to share a little if you're looking for some tidbits. So always try to find out a little bit of the history, to know where that farm's been. It may help you in being able to come up with a plan for getting your conservation objectives out there. Another important part is always watch the calendar. If it's the end of April and you're hoping to get a half a day of walking and talking on the farm, if it's that time of year, end of April, early May, or in October, early November, landowners might not be real interested, especially if they have a lot of cash grain planting or harvesting to do. So always keep that in mind, that their real busy times of the year may not be the best time to try to get on the farm. Before heading out, I always like to see map evaluations completed. The photography we have at our hands nowadays can show us a lot, give us a lot of direction on where we need to look when we're doing our farm evaluation. And it just makes us more efficient and effective. Proper field gear is another thing that we got to always take into consideration. Especially if we're going out in the cooler seasons and meeting with a landowner. He's probably been out working all morning or whatever. He's dressed for it. Make sure you are. Make sure you got your boots if you're going into a feedlot. That kind of stuff. It just makes it more effective if you're prepared for that. And go back to maps again. the maps to record the notes when you're doing a farm walkover is so huge. It's hard to remember everything you look at if you're out and covering quite a bit. So it is very important to be able to record that, and also take an extra copy of the maps along for landowners. A lot of times they like to have the most recent maps, or also like to keep their notes as you're going through it. So it's just another thought of take an extra copy for the landowner. Opening the door, getting that first initial visit sometimes can be a challenge, and you got to always make sure we don't have too high of expectations for that initial visit. You do need to be prepared for the landowner that is ready to run with several practices, but don't feel that if you don't get him to agree to fixing the resource concern that you may have identified on the first visit, it's not a failure. If you can get an invite to return at a later date and talk, you've made progress. One thing I've always found helpful is identify an icebreaker when you're meeting someone for the first time. I guess that's an old sales trick, that when you're driving into the farm, if you haven't thought of something, if there's a really nice looking farm sign, or something that catches your eye, maybe something to start the conversation off with, get the landowner talking, and just have a nice casual conversation for a little bit before you start talking business. It always helps to, again, learn some more farm history, ask some questions about the farm, about family members involved, partners involved. Get them talking. It goes so much better when the farmer, the partners that are involved are doing most of the talking, and we're doing the listening. And then make sure that after you get through that initial discussion and you're getting ready to go into business, that you're clear with the landowner what you're hoping to do. If it's a farm walkover, or if it's a follow-up on something, or maybe they'd called in and had asked someone to come out, make sure you're clear about what it is, because their time is important. A lot of times there's several things on their plate that day, so it helps if we're very clear early in the conversation of what you'd like to get done. Some pitfalls to avoid. I always caution people to respect fields and field driveways. If you get invited to drive out in the field, or the guy says, yeah, there's nothing planted out there, go ahead, drive out there. If the conditions are right, if it's not muddy, or if the snow is not too deep, then you're fine. But be very careful. Some guys are extremely picky about extra vehicle passes out there. If they're maybe a no-till farming setup, they don't want any additional traffic out there. Field driveways, if you're using them, again, make sure that they're okay to use. Check with the landowner, and if there's any questions about it, if you think it might be a little too wet, or there may be equipment coming in and out of that field driveway, park somewhere else and walk. It's very important to know when to walk. Fences, if you're heading out on a farm, you got to get through a gate or go through a fence. Make sure that is okay. Make sure that you close the fence up or close the gate up, and Don't want to make any mistakes there that might not get you invited back. Farm equipment. It is very important to recognize that farm equipment has gotten very large. So if you're driving up to a facility or meeting a landowner out in the field and he's got equipment going, make sure you're seen. Stay a safe distance back. Sometimes it's very hard to see vehicles with some of the equipment, and you definitely don't want to create a bad situation there. And be cognizant of livestock. They're always curious, and you don't want to spook them or cause an issue there. As Ed kind of said a little earlier, farmsteads can be a very, very busy place. When you are going out to meet a landowner, drive into the facility, drive slow, watch out for hazards, the machinery, people, animals. You definitely don't want to have an issue right off before you even get to meet with a landowner. When you pull into a facility similar to the one in the picture here, as you can see, there's a lot of activity around the dairy. When you park, it's always a good thing to verify with the landowner right off the bat is, I got my truck parked here, is that okay? And if you're going to pull in near a livestock area, again, don't pull right up next to a fence or something. The cattle may spook away from that, and that could be a problem. I always try to have a meeting place, especially on the larger facilities, so I'm not wondering where the guy is at, where the person that I'm meeting is at. So if you can arrange that when you set up the appointment to have a meeting place, that works best. I say do not ever enter a livestock production area unless you're invited. The biosecurity is a big deal nowadays. It's just never a good idea unless you're invited in to go into the livestock production areas. Touch on livestock just a little bit more because it is a very important part, at least here in Pierce County. With a lot of our dairies and feedlots have cattle in outside lots and stuff, and if you're standing there looking at the feedlot and the cow is showing interest in you, it's best just to leave them alone, because that animal may be acting friendly and reach over to scratch its head and it decides to not want to be scratched or run off and cause an issue or something. So it may seem kind of weird, but just watch the animals, but probably not reach out and touch them or anything. Developing relationships is with farmers, landowners, is a little bit of a challenge sometimes, but the walking and talking, listening, taking time to get to know them. It sometimes it seems like maybe we spend a little more time getting to know people nowadays before we ask, and maybe that's because some more of the people are a little hesitant to get involved with county government or state government or federal government. It just seems like something that's changed a little bit over the last year or so. That is something that we got to make sure we take plenty of time to do is get to know them. I see there was a question just popped up on biosecurity. So maybe I'll step back if that's appropriate and try to address that. The biosecurity thing that I brought up was if the concern out there is if you've been on one farm with livestock and then you go to another one, there could be diseases present, waste, soil, anything that could be on your boots, on your clothing, and if you go from one production facility to another one, that could be carried with you and become a way to have a disease spread, and it could, the landowner not knowing that you had been someplace else, just could become a big issue. So you always want to make sure that if you have been on another facility, that you let them know that you have been someplace else, or if they ask, if you've went through a decontamination or whatnot. Hope that answers that question. Now getting back to the relationships, do not expect immediate changes when you're first out there. It takes time and a lot of patience sometimes, but in the end, if you put the time up front and to get to know the landowner, it generally pays off in the end. It's very important when they're pointing out, if you're walking and talking with the landowner and they show you a spot, maybe it's where there was a gully and they made an attempt to put a grass waterway in, acknowledge those attempts, even if they may not have worked as well as we'd like to see them. Acknowledge them. It goes a long ways to seeing that they do care and they do want to make some changes, and we want to make sure that we acknowledge that and recognize that as progress, and maybe we can build off that. And then consider making non-conservation notes after initial appointments. That may be something that gets you back out there next time, and you can bring it back up, and it goes to show that you're paying attention to them and you actually care what's going on out there. So it may be something that they have going on with one of their children that they shared with you, or if there was some changes being made on the facility that really doesn't have anything to do with conservation. Make note of that. Bring it up next time you go out there. That goes a long ways. Christina, maybe you could help me out. I see there was a couple of questions popped up and then they disappeared on me.
Oh, sure. There's a question from Amanda asking, just going back to the animals, and I was going to save this for you, about the farmers' pets like dogs and cats. If they greet you, should you respond to that, going from where you mentioned about reaching out to the animals?
Ooh, that's a good question. I guess I've always, if they seem friendly, I guess, try to acknowledge that they're there. Sometimes that's a bad thing, because then you might be throwing a baseball or something the rest of the appointment, if it's a retrieving dog or something like that. But I guess unless the landowner says, hey, watch out for that cat, he likes to bite or something, usually pets are, most landowners are good about putting the mean ones away.
All right, and Lisa also asked a question while we're on here. When you refer to getting to know the landowner, how do you find a balance between getting to know them and appearing too inquisitive or nosy? Are there specific things you ask about or that you do not ask about?
That's a good question. I guess, you know, I look at if I get invited into the farm office, or if you get invited into the house, if there's, you know, a main picture or something on the wall, that always seems like a good safe thing to ask about. Or if there seems to be a, you know, say you walk into a farm office and it's all decorated with Oliver tractor memorabilia. That's a pretty safe thing to ask about, and obviously they're passionate about it, and that'll get them talking. You know, other things, I guess, if the kids are around and, you know, if they're outside shooting basketball or something like that when you're talking with the landowner, that's probably another pretty safe thing to bring up, that, you know, just small talk. But I guess that's, I don't know, it's a tough one to really say how to go about doing what's safe and what's not safe. I guess I would say if you're thinking about asking a question, see if that, run it through your head and see if that would seem reasonable if it was turned around and asked of you. I don't know, if that helps.
Great, thank you.
One thing that we have to keep in mind when we're talking conservation, we live in a world of acronyms, programs, we shorten everything up, and it's, when we're talking with other staff, other agency members, we talk in our lingo all the time. And when we are working with landowners, we have to remember that they don't live in that world every day, and we have to explain. So if you're talking about a TMDL, it's okay to talk about the TMDL, but make sure you explain it. Or if you're talking about NR 151, or you know, a lot of us throw out 590 like it's common, and to us it's common, but we got to make sure that when we're using our terms that we take the time to explain what they are. I guess I can't stress enough when we're trying to sell conservation, or we're trying to get conservation practices on the land, we are salesmen. We are trying to get a product on the land. We're trying to get a practice on the land. So walk and talk first is what I always say. And we got to listen and ask questions. The more the landowner talks, the better off we are. We can learn a lot from them on what goes on out there, and it'll help us when we're coming up with our recommendations. So that is my favorite part of my job, is when I get to go out and walk and talk with a landowner, or ride around and get them in the pickup and go across the farm. That's, you know, when we're getting ready to get some conservation going, then is when we get that started. It's important to measure the conservation ethic of the person you're with. I guess a point to make there is if we're out and we're going across a farm and it's continuous no-till and cover crops and everything's perfect, we probably can save some of our basic recommendations that we may have had, because they've probably already been addressed. So I guess just before we're making recommendations, kind of get a feel on what the landowner might be ready for, or what the landowner's already done. It may help us be efficient, I guess. Discuss solutions is really important. We've got to be careful not to just sell programs. I've found myself different times saying, well, we have this program. We've got to be careful not to do that. Let's go out and identify what the issue is, come up with a solution, and then work with the landowner saying, well, here's ways we can fix the issue. But we just don't want to go out and say, well, we got a buffer program, you want to sign up. He may not need buffers. Be confident in your recommendations. Once you've walked and talked and discussed it with the landowner, and you know what the issue is, you know what needs to be done, be confident in that recommendation. It gives you credibility that the landowner will recognize that, okay, this person knows what they're talking about, and they've got experience doing this, and they'll be much more comfortable moving forward. So be confident. And along with that, though, make sure that the goals are achievable for both. If you get out on a farm that needs a lot of conservation work, some landowners are going to want to fix it all in 1 year, and others are going to want to spread it out over 5 years or 3 years or whatever. In the end, we're getting the conservation on the land. We just got to make sure that our goals are good for both. We don't want to have a landowner that's ready to do 3 miles of waterway and then have to go back and tell them that we only have funding to do a half mile of waterway for this year. And funding was very important to them, so just make sure our goals are achievable before we commit. And this is another super important thing for developing credibility and having success out in the countryside is, if you don't know, be straight up with them. Say, you know, I don't know, but I will find out the answer to your question. And just make sure if you use that you do follow up on it. But it is perfectly acceptable. Most landowners will appreciate that you're not trying to blow smoke. That if you don't know it, you're telling them that straight up. And be ready for the whys. Quite often we'll get questions, you know, probably more in the stage of the project when you're maybe going through a design for a waterway, or if you're designing manure storage or something like that, and the landowner, well, why does it have to be that size, or why do we have to do this step and this step? Make sure you can answer those. Be prepared for the why questions. We don't want that to be something that they suddenly get uncomfortable with the project and step back because we weren't prepared to answer the whys. And I'm sure I've said this several times already this morning, change can be slow. It may happen fast, it may happen slow. We have to accept that, and we have to be prepared that changes on farms can be slow because of all the factors that we talked about early on. They may have done that certain way for many years. That feedlot may have been there for several years, maybe decades. So change can be slow, but as long as we're working towards the end result that is positive for conservation. Be patient. Another technique of the one-on-ones are generally my favorite way to work with landowners, but the small groups, bringing in a specialist can help really sell conservation. If you get a group of landowners, especially maybe on a cold winter day or something, get them in and get them talking, and they can start sharing their experiences and what they're trying. You can suddenly get a real surge in, say, a watershed project or something like that by getting a small group together and promoting conservation that way. Field days are another great way to do that. A lot of counties have tremendous success with getting things kicked off using field days and small group discussions. So, and sometimes it doesn't hurt to bring in a specialist, somebody else to reaffirm what you've been saying or what you've been talking to them about. So that can be very important. And there's nothing better than conservation champions. If you can find someone out in the country that you develop a relationship with, somebody that's passionate about conservation and willing to step up and help, those are just such wonderful people to work with, and they can do so much for conservation in their community. It's amazing. I've been fortunate to have several people to work with over the years that have really helped sell conservation. I think of one back many years ago when we were working on real steep wooded, ridge tops area in some real sensitive watersheds, and we were trying to get field borders started, and we had one landowner the first year installed. He got started, put them in, and thought they were wonderful. They worked. He seen changes in the little gullies and stuff that were forming along the woods edges right away, and he sold the program out for us. Basically, we used up all of our funding of the future years for that program by just getting lucky and getting someone that was influential in the community to get going and try it first, and then they spread it for us. So we always got to be looking for those people and not afraid when someone's interested and someone's willing to take them up on their assistance. They can do great things for us. So that they're sometimes hard to find, but if you find one, feel fortunate and really use it to the advantage of your goals. So that is kind of what I had put together.
Great. Thank you so much, Rod. And I will open it up to any other questions. Feel free to either unmute yourself or use the chat box on the bottom. But to start out, Rod, I had somebody ask about your background. And then I realized I don't think you mentioned anything where your background is or where you, why you've got this experience with communicating with farmers.
Okay. Well, I guess I would say I've had an advantage. I grew up on a dairy farm. My parents got me involved in the farm very early on, and that was kind of my plan growing up. Was I was just going to be, I wanted to be involved in agriculture, and then I ended up going to school in Stevens Point and getting a soil science degree. Started out working in agronomy, working for a fertilizer and grain company, and then got the opportunity to start in conservation in Pepin County. And So I had a good background, good foundation on how to walk and talk with agriculture from growing up and being in private industry. And now I've been working in conservation for close to 25 years, I guess, and always been fortunate enough to be able to have a position where I can work with landowners on a daily basis and learn a lot from them. I always think that almost every farm visit or office visit, I learn something from a landowner that I can use or that helps me in my job. So I guess I'm always thankful for that opportunity.
Great. Thank you. Let's see here. So we do have a question, if you can see it on the chat box. What are some good tips in talking with farmers who are basically requiring to spend money to do something like nutrient management planning, or when they have to invest some of their own money through cost-sharing agreements? How do you address the attitude of what's in it for me and their anger when you require them to spend the money to get into compliance? Good question.
That's an awesome question. I guess you know, if they're spending money out of their own pocket, you gotta try to find value in it. If it's nutrient management planning, that seems like one that you can sit down with them and show them the dollar signs fairly easy. I know it costs money to have plans developed, but that's an excellent investment to find out exactly what the crops that you're planning to grow need, what your soil has to provide out there, what you need to provide from other sources. So, you know, in the case of nutrient management, I think it's showing them the dollar signs on what they used to be putting on and what the recommendations call for. You know, that helps a lot of the time. On some of the larger facilities, our large livestock facilities, I often tell them that it's documentation. You know, it may be something that you don't need for your whole farming career, and it may be something that you need next week if all of a sudden there's a groundwater issue in your area. Having some sort of documentation with nutrient management plans on what you've been doing is helpful. I'm sure that in the legal world it's not going to completely save you, but it's sure cheap investment to have that documentation. So, you know, in other conservation practices, farmland is very valuable. I often use the argument that you know, you're protecting something that you're willing to pay thousands and thousands of dollars an acre for. So putting, you know, a little bit of money into building a grass waterway or controlling a head cut with a grade stabilization structure is a pretty good investment to protect something that people are paying a lot of money for.
Thanks. Does anybody else have any questions? Again, feel free to unmute yourself or use that chat box below. Rod, I have a quick question then. How about when you have a farmer that you're trying to engage on a project, and when do you finally walk away? When do you call it quits, or when do you ever get to that point, or do you just slowly chip away? Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, I guess there comes a point that you do have to say, I guess this isn't going to happen now. You always try to leave the door open and hope that they come in, but I have unfortunately had a few landowners that I've had to say, you know what, I guess they're not ready to make this change. They're not ready to address the resource concerns, and you try to touch base now and again with them just to keep them thinking about it. But you also don't want to burn any bridges with that landowner, because something may change. They may in the future need your assistance, or change the way they look at the issue. And so I guess I always try to keep it open. I don't ever just write somebody off, but there does come a point that if you've spent 7 or 8 visits with them and you flat out asked them, if you get to that point of saying, okay, where are we at? Are you going to do this project, or are you going to make this change? When you feel comfortable with making that question or asking that question, if they say no, we do not feel that that's right for our operation, or we do not feel that that's necessary. If you get a flat out no, and there's no, you don't see that it's a regulatory issue that you can and want to pick that fight, sometimes you got to walk away. But I would always try to keep touch one way or another, if it's making sure that they remain on the newsletter list, or if you're sending out emails of practice successes or something like that, make sure you keep them in the loop.
Great, thanks. That is helpful. Any other questions before Rod goes? And again, we do have a upcoming in-person, and Rod is going to be there for that, where we'll kind of dive into a few more of more specific kind of case studies and walking through how to go through scenarios, and that'll be on June 2nd in Columbia County. Again, if you're interested, I can send out that email on how to register. It's on and also on our website. So if there are no other questions, all right, Rod, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm assuming if people have follow-up questions, they can feel free to email me, and I can get those through to Rod, or is it okay if they email you?
Absolutely.
Directly?
Yep. They can just send it to me directly if they want. I'll try my best to answer it.
All right.
So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Bye.